Well, this is my annual evening to wear all the hats. And so you all know who I am. I don't think you probably need an introduction. But I'm the president of the Historical Society. We're glad to have you here. I will add, I'm not sure which program we will have next month. Our speaker scheduled for next month had sudden death of his wife last week, and so we may swap him with another speaker, whatever his preference is. But this is a program that I actually started putting together back in 2020, and the Glasgow Daily Times had invited me to do this as a big feature for a magazine they were doing. But before we got the magazine out, they shut down the newspaper. So it was very unfortunate because 2020. Did you unplug me?
No, I've not unplugged you. I've turned you down a little bit because I'm getting a lot of feedback.
You turned me down a lot. That's better. But it's a shame because 2020 was the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote. And we had no source for this, but it's one of those stories that just keeps growing. And one of the things that I notice on Sam Terry's Kentucky is there's every day people comment, well, I didn't know that. I didn't learn that in high school. I had a terrible history teacher. No, you didn't. You had a great history teacher. We just weren't talking about the same things. 50 or 60 years ago, women's history wasn't a thing yet. And we weren't doing much discussion of black history 60 and 70 years ago in our classrooms. And so a lot of this information simply isn't in textbooks. It's not in local histories. I've always been bothered by the fact we have all these wonderful local history books. And if you just look through them and you look for the stories of women, they're not there. And you think, what a shame. And so Franklin Gorin was actually one of the most complete historians because he did write about a lot of the pioneer women in our community, but at the same time, others had been left out. If you looked at those books, you would know we had Joanne Foster Park, named for a woman. We have Beulah Nunn Park, named for a woman. And until about 10 years ago, that was it in all of Barren County.
You would Clubhouse.
There would be Mitchell Clubhouse. And so we did at least get the historical markers for Nettie Depp and Willa Brown and recognize their accomplishments on our courthouse lawn. So this is a conglomeration of things that we'll start with some of the background of how Kentucky was doing suffrage. And we don't have a remote, so we'll have to wing it. But Kentucky was actually ahead of the game in a lot of areas. In 1881, Laura Clay and Mary Barr Clay and a number of other ladies started meeting, thinking of creating the Kentucky Equal Rights Association. That actually came about in 1888. And one of the interesting things that I think a lot of people don't recognize is the variety of things that these ladies were working for. It was not just women's rights and the right to vote. They were also working on things like insane asylums, mental institutions, child labor, all of those things. This group lobbied and sort of coerced Transylvania University into becoming a co-ed school in the 1880s. And they had a lot of achievements. They improved orphanages in their work as well. So we have Kira, that's a term that we know from our modern times, but we had a previous Kira. I will point out that badge over on the far right, Mrs. Grant Lilly, if you're not familiar with her, she was a woman newspaper editor in Richmond, Kentucky. She's also the person who is responsible for getting the state legislature to designate My Old Kentucky Home as our state song in the mid-1920s. And a group of the ladies here. The lady in the center with the dark parasol is Laura Clay, daughter of Cassius Clay. And you notice that same banner that we have as a historical artifact now in that photograph. But things were happening in Barren County, and you won't find this in local history too much. We had the Glasgow Equal Rights Association, founded in 1890. They had 13 members. We only know 3 of the officers. Judge T.G. Reynolds was the vice president, Miss Ella Porter was the secretary, and Miss Emma Reynolds Evans was the treasurer and later the president. This is information that comes from Laura Clay's personal papers that are housed at the University of Kentucky. And I haven't been able to determine if T.G. Reynolds and Emma Reynolds were related, but I think they are, because they are buried very near one another in our local cemetery. Cave City was in on this too. We had the Cave City Committee of the Kentucky Equal Rights Association. Lizzie Curd Tucker was the chairman in 1905. Her husband George was known as Telephone Tucker. He owned Tucker Telephone Company, which provided the first telephone service for Cave City, Horse Cave, Park City, Smiths Grove, Hiceville, a little bit of Edmonson County, and was a very interesting character. His family did a lot of interesting things. One of Lizzie's daughters was the telegraph operator in Cave City, and she was the person who was sending all the telegrams about Floyd Collins being trapped in the cave. And we haven't heard much about her either. The other interesting thing I will add is that George Tucker is the person who named a very familiar road that many of us use on a day-to-day basis. There's a valley between Glasgow and Cave City, and that was the last area that he did not have telephone poles and his telephone lines installed. And the people who lived in that area were terribly disappointed that they didn't have phone service. So when he finally got that completed, he made the comment to his friends, "The people in the valley will be happy tonight." And ever since, it's been known as Happy Valley, and we have Happy Valley Road to this day. One person we know a lot more about, Nettie Depp, decided to run for public office 7 years before women got the right to vote. At that time, the superintendent of schools was an elected office, just like the sheriff, the county clerk, the circuit clerk, PPA, a different title at that time. But in 1913, she was the first woman to ever appear on an election ballot in Barren County, and she was elected and served a 4-year term. I've always been amazed by the fact that the superintendent got a free apartment in the courthouse as part of their pay. I'm not sure I really want to live in the courthouse. and I've heard a few stories about her adventures living in the courthouse, but kind of amazing that she did that. Also amazing is the fact that when she was superintendent, she was overseeing 132 one-room schools scattered all over Barren County.
Wow.
And she also had the idea to rent the old Liberty College buildings and form Glasgow's first high school. She and E.B. Terry joined forces, and the two school boards agreed that they would open a united four-year high school, which did not exist in Barren County. You could go to the 8th grade, and that was it. You would have to go somewhere else to have a high school diploma prior to that. So certainly a person that deserves a lot of recognition. Then we also had the Barren County League of the Kentucky Equal Rights Association. Never been able to find out when this group was formed. It's also found in Laura Clay's papers. The president in 1914 was a lady named Dora Shirley Terry. Her husband was Nathaniel Duncan Terry, and he was Barren County Court Clerk at this time. And she was involved in a lot of different things politically at a time that women weren't involved in such things. So December 9th, 1919, we had a Republican governor, Edwin Porch Morrow from Somerset, who became our governor. And within days, he had outlined to the General Assembly 12 points that he wanted to address during his administration. And one of those was passing the 19th Amendment in Kentucky. And so, less than a month after he becomes governor, the General Assembly did vote. The House 72 to 25, the Senate 30 to 8, and we were the 23rd state to ratify the 19th Amendment, and one of just 4 southern states that I think ever ratified it. It took 36 to become the law of the land, and that would come a little bit later. But these ladies were awfully excited. This is the Kira group. The lady right here is Madeline McDowell Breckenridge. She's Henry Clay's granddaughter, and married into the Breckenridge family. She's the person who saved Ashland for us to be able to visit today. But they were all gathered there for Governor Morrow to sign this legislation for Kentucky to ratify the 19th Amendment. You can see how the Lexington Herald did that. But just a few months later, the Kentucky League of Women Voters emerges. And the explanation for this is Kentucky Equal Rights Association had agreed many years ago, prior to the 19th Amendment being passed, that when women got the right to vote, they would change their name to the League of Women Voters. And so May of 1920, the meeting was actually held on the 4th. Barren County had 4 ladies who traveled to Louisville, and they were part of the group that helped perfect the Constitution and the bylaws for the Kentucky League of Women Voters. And as you can see there, Dora Terry, Belle McCandless, Nettie Depp. Mrs. W.F. Richardson was Bernice Summers. Some of you would remember her granddaughter. Well, this is embarrassing, isn't it? Elizabeth Harlow and Mrs. Joe Bybee. And Mrs. Park was the head of the national organization. She had come to Kentucky to work with the Kentucky women in creating the bylaws, changing the name of Kira to the League of Women Voters, and very unusual that a rural county such as ours is this involved. This is just a priceless article. Glasgow Times, May the 12th. The original copy of the newspaper is just terrible. So I typed it out for you. The Democratic Convention last Saturday was a cross between a corkscrew and a hammer. Beginning with about 50 people, it went out with between 300 and 400 in attendance. It was better than a moving picture show, and for rapid action was equal to a Gatling gun or the hindquarters of a mule. Judge Jones presided over the deliberations with grace and dignity. Everybody was happy and in a good humor. The convention adjourned after declaring for an uninstructed delegation complimenting everything in sight and doing its work 2 or 3 times over. And there were 15 or 20 ladies participating, talking and looking like they were scared to death. And I'm not sure if I really believe that or not, but certainly an entertaining write-up about that meeting and what went on there for the people of Barren County. Same edition of the paper, we have W.E. Jones as the chairman, and right off the bat, he appoints a 5-person committee to be a committee of resolutions, and he selected 2 women for that. And, you know, and the 19th Amendment hadn't gone into effect yet, but the local political leaders were behaving and operating as though it had. They knew it was going to happen. And the article gives in great detail the fact that they endorsed Woodrow Wilson for re-election. They supported the idea of the United Nations. They were in support of the candidate for Congress and a few other things like that related to the upcoming election. But something else happened that had never happened before. They selected 28 local women to be voting delegates to the Kentucky Democratic Party convention. They had never voted in an election yet, but they were sending them as a voting delegate. And we know who they were. And this is the order that they appear in that article. Nettie Depp, who had been on that resolutions committee, Nell Bohannon Vaughn would be a key person. She was the daughter of Judge G.M. Bohannon, who in 1920 was our sitting county judge. He was judge for 37 years in Barren County. I will also add that Nell Vaughn was named the first commissioner of state parks in Kentucky because of her political connections. Her son, William Warner Vaughn, known as Billy, not the musician Billy, but Billy won in 1946. He created Glasgow's first radio station, WKAY, and then he went to work in Washington, D.C. for Alvin Barkley and continued as his chief assistant through the years that Barkley was vice president of the United States. He's also the reason Barkley came to Glasgow a lot. You know, if you're the politico underneath the politician, you want to take care of the home folks and impress them. And so he arranged for Barkley to come to Glasgow to do things like be the speaker at Glasgow High School's commencement. I mean, try to top that the next year. The vice president came. And we did some interesting things for him as well. Like we gave him a Hereford bull, which was put on the train and sent to the Angles, his home and farm in Paducah. And he was quite popular here. Mrs. E.C. Davis, Lizzie Ford, and her grandson is here tonight. She became the grandmother of Elizabeth Ann Davis Rogers, and of course the great-grandmother of Ben and John and other Rogers, and obviously a Cave City person. Mrs. J.R. Davis, I can't track anything down about. Bernice Summers was from the Hinesville area, but had moved to town, and Mrs. Selby Thompson and Mrs. Bud Ritter sound very familiar, but they're very elusive in records. Mrs. Garland Page was Carrie Bell Edmonds. She is the Edmonds family that lived in the Octagon Cottage at Beckton. And her mother was a Crane from the Hinesville and Rock Springs area. Nettie Lessenberry Winlock Billings was among that group. One of the interesting things, if you're not familiar with her, one, she lived to be 101. Her first husband was Dr. Winlock in Hinesville, who was a Confederate veteran. He died after they had been married a number of years. And then she married Mr. Billings, who was a Spanish-American War veteran and a World War I veteran. And he passed on before Nettie. And so she had the distinction of being Barren County's last Confederate widow, last Spanish-American War widow, and a widow of World War I. So quite a distinction. We have two sisters that show up, Mrs. Jim Crenshaw from Tick Ridge Road, and her sister, Aline Alexander, was living nearby in Hinesville and later in Glasgow. Mrs. John B. King, I can't track her down. Janie Satterfield Hatcher, Annie Mae Lewis Deering, Mrs. Hence Bowles, Mrs. Billy Woodson, Mrs. Earl Harston, Mrs. Jeff Hicks, Mrs. John Britt, Mrs. Earl Smith, Dora Shirley Terry, Mrs. W.R. Harlan, Della Price Depp, Mrs. Walter Carey. Dora Lee Combs was the daughter of Horace Combs, who was a local business man here in Glasgow. Laverne Pettigo and Margaret Richardson was the sister of Judge Basil Richardson. So she was from Monroe County originally, but again, we don't ever hear anything about these women and the fact that they were going to Louisville to be a voting delegate at a time that they had never voted, and they were just being given the right to do so. At the same time, Dora had the distinction of being named an alternate delegate to the San Francisco Democratic National Convention. She didn't get to serve, but she was still the person that was delegated to fill in if someone couldn't fulfill their duties. Lots of interesting little tidbits in our local papers. Have the right to vote for presidential electors. There was a question because Kentucky had passed the ratification of the amendment, but it had not been ratified nationally. There were still states that were considering this, and so there was a question whether they were going to get to vote in November or not. The Attorney General concluded that they would be able to cast their ballots in the November election for president. But then everything fell into place. We have to have a little Tennessee history along with Kentucky history. August the 19th, the Tennessee legislature was considering the ratification of the 19th Amendment. The young man there is Harry T. Barren. He was a state representative. The lady next to him is his mother, Phoebe Barren, and it was quite a heated thing. They took ballot after ballot after ballot in Tennessee. They even wrote sheet music about it because the two factions had adopted roses. The anti-suffrage folks had American Beauty roses that were red, and the folks in favor of suffrage were all wearing yellow roses. So it was known popularly as the War of the Roses in Tennessee. During those deliberations that went on for days, Mrs. Barren wrote Harry a note, and she mentioned that she was listening to the coverage of the hearings, and she thought the male legislators were bitter and not very kind. And she had been listening for what he was going to say, and she had noticed he had not said anything. And she gave him a bit of advice, and that was, when you vote, be sure to vote to put the rat in ratification for Mrs. Catt. And Mrs. Catt, Carrie Catt, was the national leader of the suffrage movement at that time. And so Mrs. Catt was the #1 face of suffrage. And Harry was the person who changed his vote and voted in favor of suffrage, which changed the entire nation and our Constitution. Everybody was upset with him. They chased him through the halls of the Tennessee State Capitol. He finally escaped into the attic of the building. He went through a window and onto the ledge around the outer portion of the building, hiding from these people because he was afraid they might hang him if they ever caught him. But it stuck and it made history, and so as a result, suffrage was going to be successful. The Constitution would be amended, and women would have the right to vote. I have to love the headline that Tennessee ratifies suffrage amendment, Warsaw is safe, and the Poles strike at Danzig line. So we've got all the world news in 2 sentences, or 2 lines there. But meantime, here's Nell Bohannon Vaughn. The photo of her is from 1941 when she was Commissioner of State Parks in Kentucky, but she was immediately named the Democratic Women's Organization head to head up the campaign to re-elect Woodrow Wilson. The event at Old Malky, she had a major role in Old Malky becoming a state park, and in this photo she's speaking with an 89-year-old lady, Mrs. Phoebe Jane Eaton of Rock Bridge in Monroe County, and there was supposed to have been a religious museum built at Old Malky Park and named in honor of Nell Vaughn. And interestingly, it just evaporated. No one knows what happened to the movement. If you notice the date, September 30th, 1941, I suspect what happened to it was World War II, and everybody got busy saving the country instead of building religious museums. The Glasgow Daily Times, it wasn't daily yet, I'll have to take that back, October 21st, 1920, reminding people that any person, male or female, black or white, who's 21 years old, has the right to vote. If you want to make no mistake, all you have to do is put your cross in the circle under the log cabin. And of course, remember, the Daily Times was the Democratic paper. We also had the Glasgow Republican. They weren't as vocal on this. Nobody in Barren County has to register in order to vote. You don't even have to be able to read in order to vote. You don't have to show a tax receipt in order to vote. You don't have to pay more taxes if you do vote. So you can imagine the various tales that were going around, and perhaps some intimidation of people. Interesting little quip here that gentleman saying, I won't vote if my wife votes, and besides, I won't let her come home either. Repeated the husband voter Republican who had a Democratic wife. Don't you know, Mr. Smarty, that there is a severe penalty in force for people who intimidate voters? You are apt to have your name reported if you keep wifey from the polls on election day. I suspect that no one actually sent that in, that was a clever way for the newspaper to encourage people to understand that this was a law, they couldn't change it. Owners of autos in Barren County who are patriotic enough to promise to use their autos for the purpose of bringing women to the polls who wish to vote the Democratic ticket on November 2nd will please drop a card to Bryce Leach, who was at that time the mayor of Glasgow, or J.A. Murray, stating on what road they prefer to work. We must organize to get our Democratic women's vote. So the women are going to get to vote. It's passed, and the big question comes down to the parties. And parties in 1920, Democrat and Republican, were nothing like those parties are today. They almost flipped in a lot of their stances on things. So we do get into some things that weren't necessarily pleasant. I love this, that Miss Sally Greer, aged 84 of Roseville section, and Mrs. Sanders, age 82, a neighbor, sent word to the Glasgow Times that they are going to vote the straight Democratic ticket on November 2nd. The next item is that, a quote, I can't tell what one woman with whom I have been living for 30 years will do. Therefore, who can tell what 30 million women will do on Election Day? Replied the tired man to the Republican and Democratic campaign managers claiming the woman vote. Both parties wanted to get those women in their corner in voting for their candidates. The Republican didn't have nearly as much to say about all of this, but they traded barbs quite a lot. Judging from appearances, the Democratic Party has mistaken the women of Kentucky for sugar and taffy sort of people. They are not. The Republican Party knows they are not, and it is urging them to vote Republican ticket strictly on the issues. Kentucky women are not blind. They do not want a Wilson League of Nations, which means that American lads must be constantly in the military service, possibly fighting and dying for other nations whose interests are not ours. They do not want to barter off the Constitution and the American right of independent thinking and acting to European politicians and self-seekers. They do not want to continue in office for 4 more years, a party that has kept taxation at high pitch, that has practiced despotism, that has left public will and desire entirely out of the administrative action, that is wasted and squandered on a scale unequaled in history. Does this not sound just like the news now? The strategies haven't changed a lot. Another reminder, this one is from the Republican, for Kentucky men and women to vote the next week. And this one I love. October 1920. That old saying, time brings forth many changes, has proven quite true in the course of events in the past few weeks. Only a short time since, the fair sex were kept busy wondering where the next tea or card party would be. But now the thought uppermost in milady's mind is, shall I vote? Or who will be the next president? Anyway, it is safe to say that November 2nd will prove far more interesting than any afternoon tea. And the result of that from the Glasgow Times, November 3rd, was Wilson was defeated. He was not reelected. Harding and Coolidge won, and then down, kind of buried at the bottom, is all fear that the women would not vote was groundless, as the women divided with the men in the number of votes cast. Voting was especially heavy in precinct number 4 in town, meaning Glasgow, where 562 votes were cast. Very little confusion was noticed, and few ballots were spoiled by the new voters. And then there's a mention that there weren't any votes cast for Glasgow School Board for various reasons in there. And then you know what was going to happen next. The women are going to be on the jury. And so the newspaper is giving fair warning that they're probably going to be there. And just get ready for it. Men, you're going to have to give up some seats, and you may have a lady sitting next to you if you're on the jury in Barren County Court. This is kind of an interesting thing. So May 1921, the next year, the Glasgow Times announced the candidates for Barren County Clerk. These were all Democrats running in their primary. And the very last person is Miss Bess Howard. Bess Howard was a school teacher at the time, and she defeated all of those male opponents. There were some big names in their running, and it's really quite amazing that she won that, but she remained in office for the next 33 years. The reason I put that graphic with it, that is Bess Howard's teaching certificate. And Howard Gray has this and sent this to me. The person who had examined and signed Bess Howard's teaching certificate was Nettie B. Depp, the Barren County School Superintendent. So the first two women to run for public office right there together. And finally, many of you probably know that Nettie Depp was selected to represent all Kentucky women in our Capitol. She's in the West Lobby, and that statue was unveiled in November of last year, and she is the first woman in Kentucky history to be portrayed in a statue in the Capitol. There's a bust, but not a full life-size statue. And so certainly something for Barren County to be proud of.
And who did it?
Amanda Matthews, who is a great niece of Nettie Depp, is a sculptor in Lexington, and she worked for a few years creating that. Any other questions?
Hey, Sam, that J.A. Depp that was mentioned in one of the clips there, is that old Red? J.A. Burry?
Yes, it is. And he was on his last legs in 1920. He died just a day or two after the November general election. And so his participation was somewhat marginal. He was in very poor health and didn't live to really see what all might happen with women having the right to vote. I will add that one of the big issues with Democrats at this time was they were very concerned about the fact that black individuals were registering as Republicans. And their big concern was that you were going to have lots of black women voting. And there are some pretty racist ads in the newspapers from that era. The big concern was that if we have all of these black people voting, our kids are going to have to go to the white school and be sitting beside a black student. We're going to have to share our train car sleepers with black people in the same car, and they're going to just take over everything. And so there was a lot of bickering back and forth, and a lot of it unfounded somewhat, as just propaganda to intimidate people. But it was quite lively and very spirited. Any other questions? Yes.
How would women have gotten to the polls to vote? Would they have been taken by their husbands?
They could have, but there were cars around, and some
Did
women were driving.
drive?
Yes.
Did women drive then?
Yes.
Where were the polls at that time?
Amazingly, some of them were actually in private homes here in town. Not intimidating at all. And some were in vacant storehouses in the rural areas, the post office.
They were throughout Barren County. They weren't
Yes.
just in Glasgow.
Yes. Glasgow had, I think, about 5 polling places, 5 precincts in the city limits, which of course were extremely small at that time. And the county had probably 20. It's actually not terribly different than the number we have today. But I think women would have gone any way they could if they were determined to vote, even if they had to walk.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, please.
Are there records of how people voted at that time? As far as, I'm interested how many women actually voted with their husband, like,
I don't think you would find that.
on that.
I think it would just be the total.
Sam, you mentioned the Edmonds octagonal house.
Yes.
Was either one of his daughters or granddaughters, I can't recall which, was the first female attorney?
Yes. Mary Annie Barnhill. Mary Annie Edmonds Barnhill. And she was reared down there, and she was the first female member of the bar in Barren County, and that was in the 20s also.
Yeah, very unusual thing.
She became a professor at Eastern Kentucky University,
Didn't know that.
and actually just died maybe 30, 35 years ago. She was quite elderly.
Miss Bess Howard was the wife of Dr.
She was his sister.
The sister.
And I'm sure that had a huge role in her popularity and in her success. As the story's been told for decades that Dr. Howard would make house calls, of course, at that time, and people would say, well, how much do we owe you for your services? And his response would be, oh, you don't owe me anything. Bessie might run again. and Bess had some pretty clever campaigning ideas too. For example, she had pencils imprinted with "Vote for Bess Howard" on them, which she visited every one-room school in Barren County and distributed to the students. And there are some facetious tales about it, but some have claimed they didn't know until they got to high school that all pencils didn't say "Vote for Bess Howard." It was the only one they had, and she brought a fresh pencil every year. And so she also utilized everyday items that women would have used, such as thimbles, imprinted with "Vote for Bess Howard" on them. So she had some clever things. And her defeat in 1953 was a huge upset in Barren County politics. There was a political divide within the Democratic Party here. And this was also the election that brought about the Pat Kingery and Kentuckians recording "I Put the Jam on the Lower Shelf so the Little Man Can Reach It." And it's a long story, but the end result was Miss Bess got caught up in something she had nothing to do with, and people voted for someone else, and she lost. But the Vance brothers were one part of that faction, and Boots Vance and J. Wood Vance campaigned at every little crossroad in Barren County, all the country stores, and Wood made the comment in his speeches that Miss Bess should not be reelected, that she has said every time she's run that this was her last race and she was not going to run again. And if you vote for her one more time, she will have been county court clerk of Barren County longer than Jesus walked on the earth. And she was in office for 33 years. And so there were a lot of interesting things going on in politics.
She never married, didn't
No, she didn't.
Who beat her, Sam?
Robert Fant.
The first time she ran, what did she win by?
Yeah.
That I don't know. But that's a great question.
I just wonder if the newly
That's quite-
empowered women had any role in her election against all those men.
Oh, I would think so. And she was involved in social things in Glasgow. Like, she was one of the founders of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And, you know, they were well-to-do ladies for the most part, and they had influence on people, and she was a part of that, and so her name was known. She was in the paper constantly because of all those activities, and she was highly involved in First Christian Church, taught Sunday school there for a long, long time. She was the first woman made an elder in her church congregation in the 60s, which was almost unheard of in rural areas at that time, and a unique lady.
Interesting.
So she would be the aunt of Lois Gray.
Yes. Yes.
Her genes scare y'all, certainly,
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
in leadership.
Mhm. No doubt about it. And when she was defeated, Happy Chandler was governor, and so he put her in a position in the State Parks Department for a period of time. So she wasn't here for a little while. She went to Frankfurt and worked with the state park system, which of course was pretty small in the mid-50s.
Where did she live in Glasgow?
Cleveland Avenue for a while, and then she moved over to West Brown Street into the Bradford home that's still there. I could take you to it, but I don't know the number off the top of my head. But she spent the rest of her life in that home on West Brown Street.
And how old was she when she died?
She was in her 80s, I think. But women that we ought to hear more about. We ought to talk about them more. We ought to see their names in history books and the subject of programs and articles and so forth.
Well,
So,
that's quite a statue that her niece, great niece,
Mhm.
whoever, I mean, that's.
it is. It's very handsome.
Yes.
Very nice piece.
And women wore hats in those days.
Sure.
Everywhere, didn't
Nettie, it's very interesting to read her reports to the state superintendent of public instruction from the year she was superintendent, because she had some ideas that she was hinting at One, she was working to put libraries in all of her individual schools, a lending library. She was advocating music in the classroom. Her theory was that music was a soothing thing, and it solved a lot of problems if you just stopped and had some music for a while, and that would change your attitude and that sort of thing. She started bookkeeping classes and typewriting classes that were just, rather new things for that time. And she also had to deal with the black schools, because in addition to all of those white one-room schools, there were around 20 to 30 black one-room schools. And in her report, she makes the comment that she wishes that she could put the schools for the black children on wheels, because they were mostly sharecroppers. And they moved from farm to farm at the first of the year. And her idea was if the school could be mobile and I could take the school where the children are, it would solve a lot of problems. But it's also interesting when you realize the things superintendents deal with. In her report, she's talking about how many cisterns she had dug, how many outhouses she had built, how many schools she built, how many roofs were repaired. She laments that at certain times of the rainy season, the creeks were swollen, and she couldn't ford the creek to get to the school to visit. And she took nephews and nieces with her on some of those visits when she had a little Model A Ford. And when she got stuck, their job was to push her out. So everybody had a job. So interesting things. We don't think about all of those mundane things being something that the superintendent was going to deal with. And she was instrumental in beefing up the compulsory attendance laws, because when she was superintendent, parents didn't have to send their children to school, and she was concerned about that, and she wanted to make sure that if fathers didn't send their children, they could be put in jail by the county judge until they got things sorted out. And so lots of interesting things.
Was she married?
No,
She never married.
not at all.
Was she the one lived in the courthouse?
Yes. Yes. I just can't imagine going in at night in the dark in that big old creaking courthouse with no electricity.
The one she lived in, didn't it burn?
No, it was torn down in '64. It preceded the one that's in the middle of the square now.
That was what it was most well known for, that it was creaky and
Yes, yes.
what I've heard everybody say.
Yeah, it has seen its better day from what I've heard about it. Well, thank you all for coming.
Well, thank you, Sam. Very